Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IAC Culture Talk Series at the Institute for Australian Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. I'm Professor Jing Han, the director of this institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded land of the Darug people of Darug Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land, and pay our respect to the First Nations elders past, present, and emerging. As a bilingual professional and academic, I believe a good test, if you have an in-depth understanding of other culture, is if you get its humor. Today, we will dive into Chinese humor, and the speaker is the renowned China specialist, Professor Jocelyn Chey, AM. Professor Jocelyn Chey is adjunct professor and was the founding director of this institute. She is also adjunct professor at the Australian-China Relations Institute, University of Technology, Sydney, UTS, and a visiting professor at the University of Sydney. Jocelyn's academic studies and distinguished diplomatic postings have spanned more than half a century, beginning in the 1950s. Jocelyn grew up in England and emigrated to Australia with her family in 1952. In 1956, she enrolled at the University of Sydney and was among a cohort of 20 undergraduates who formed the first class in Chinese studies offered by the university after World War II. 5 years later, Jocelyn was one of the 4 who completed an honors degree majoring in Chinese. She went to Hong Kong on a British Commonwealth scholarship and completed her master's degree at the University of Hong Kong in 1963. While in Hong Kong, she met and married her husband, Moon Chey. That's why it's Jocelyn Chey. Later, they moved to Sydney, and Jocelyn completed her PhD at University of Sydney and became a lecturer. In 1973, Jocelyn was appointed China Relations Officer in the Department of Overseas Trade before being posted to Beijing Embassy as the first Australian Cultural Counselor in 1975. She was also the first Executive Director of the Australian China Council from 1979 to 1984, and Senior Trade Commissioner in Beijing from 85 to 88. Then she became the director of the China branch of the International Wool Secretariat. Her last posting was as Consul General to Hong Kong and Macau from 1992 to 1995. Among Jocelyn's research areas spanning Chinese history and philosophy, Australian-Asian culture and trade relations, Hong Kong history, international relations, she also has developed a new research interest in Chinese humor, or in her words, humor with Chinese characteristics. She has contributed and co-edited 2 books on this subject, Humour in Chinese Life and Letters, and Humour in Chinese Life and Culture. So we are thrilled and greatly honoured to have Jocelyn to talk about Chinese humour in our IAC Culture Talks series. At the end of the lecture, we will take questions from audiences. So please post your questions at the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen during the lecture, and I will collect them for Jocelyn to respond after she finishes her lecture. So now please welcome Professor Jocelyn Chey, AM, to give us the talk on a serious look at Chinese humor.
Thank you, Jing. The history of humor in China is as long as the history of the Chinese Communist Party, and that's not a joke. Actually, the party is 3 years older. The origin of humor in China can be dated very precisely, since the term Humour is a neologism which was coined by the writer Lin Yutang in 1924. And he invented this word as a deliberate cross-cultural act because he wanted to exchange the meaning between West and East. And humour, obviously, is a transliteration of the English word humour. Those were dark days of political and intellectual repression by the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. And Lin advocated that if you used European-style humour, it would be a form of resistance and a means to counteract the autocracy. He founded a magazine called Lunyu, which refers to the Analect's collection of Confucius sayings, a basic text of Confucianism. That was to highlight the ancient origin of humour and humorous thinking. But the type of humour that he advocated was not really Confucian at all, as I'm going to explain. But Lin's writings and the magazine Lunyu were so popular that most people nowadays think that humour has always been the Chinese term for humour, which it hasn't. So, in 1923, in an essay, Lin Yutang claimed that Chinese people had always had a sense of humour, but they'd just forgotten how to use it, and they feared loss of face if they were too funny. And he defined humour as the highest form of intelligence and reasonableness. And in the first issue of his magazine, Lunyu, or the Analects, he set out the journal's editorial policy, which is really in itself quite funny. I'm not going to read all of it to you, but you can see the sort of sarcasm when he wrote, "We will not be counter-revolutionary." And then he wrote further down, "We will not be satellites to the elite, the powerful or the rich. We will not be press agents for dramatic stars, cinema stars, social stars, intellectual stars, political stars, etc." And then he said, "We will not be a group of mutual admirers. We're against flesh creepyism. We will avoid terms like the famous scholar, the famous poet, and so on. And we will certainly not use the expression, my good friend Hu Shi, who was a famous scholar." And finally he said, "We will not advocate justice. We will just make known our honest prejudices. We're not going to swear off anything like smoking, drinking tea, or getting up late. And we will not admit that our writings are poor and in bad taste." So that was Lin Yutang's definition of humour. Let's go back a bit, because he wrote this journal and he called it Lunyu, the Confucian Analects. The history of humour actually has to start with a reference to Confucius, because his philosophy governed everyday life and social relations in China over centuries. And the text Lunyu shows that Confucius considered that an ideal society, which was founded on appropriate relations between the ruler and citizens, between husbands and wives, between parents and children, had only a very limited place for humour. It had to be in its proper place, and it was used for moral instruction and for reproof. He himself actually demonstrated this, as we can see from this quotation from the Lunyu, where a nobleman called Ji Kang came to him to complain about having been robbed. And he answered Lord Ji Kang in this way, said, "If you yourself hadn't been so greedy, they wouldn't have robbed you even if you paid them to do so." So that's a kind of what I call a Confucian use of humour. It serves to reprove people. It serves for moral instruction. And you can still find examples of that kind of humor today. For instance, there are a great many proverbs which are in common use every day. I'll just give you one example. This is from the Taoist classic, Zhuangzi, where there's a story about a man who was in charge of monkeys, and he offered his monkeys 4 nuts in the morning and 3 in the evening. And good unionists, they objected that they weren't being fed enough. So he changed his offer, said, okay, you can have 3 in the morning and 4 in the evening. And they accepted this offer without further consideration. So that led to a well-known proverb, Jocelyn, which means that it's used to criticize or chastise people who cannot make up their minds or who are more concerned about themselves, and so that blinds them to the real situation. That's the use of humor to reprove, to correct, to inform, or to educate. And another place we can find this kind of record of improving humor is in the history of people who were called the Huajishi. They were employed by the imperial court as jesters, but their job was not just to amuse the aristocracy, but also to give advice in a way that was more palatable. In the 2nd century BC, there's a famous book called the Book of History, or the Records of the Grand Historian, which records the lives and the sayings of several notable jesters. And of course you can find jesters in other cultures, but the role of jesters in China, I think, differs subtly from the European records, where jesters were often also called fools. And jesters were, in fact, fools whose main job was to provide amusement to the rulers and the noblemen. Let me give you one little story about a Chinese jester, a man called Ma Ling, who lived we know that he was alive round about the year 1105, and that is the Southern Tang dynasty. And in response to a question from the emperor, which we presume was about the weather forecast, Ma Ling said, "鱼觉抽水不敢入城." The rain fears that it will be taxed, so the rain is not going to come into the city. That kind of humorous response was designed to catch the emperor off guard and provided an opportunity for the jester to advise the emperor not to impose excessive taxes on the people. So these are all examples of what I'm calling Confucian humor. Now, this is just my term. I want to make it clear that it's not an authorized term. The people who are experts in Confucian philosophy might not agree with me, but it is definitely one tradition or school of humor in China. And it obviously has a history that goes back much longer than just the 100 years since Lin Yu Tang. Based on what we have of written records, it goes back at least 2,000 years, back to the time of Confucius. Now, the earliest Chinese joke book, which is called Xiaolin, the Forest of Laughter, was written in the 3rd century AD, and that also is worth noting because many people believe that the oldest book of jokes in the world is the Byzantine Greek Philogelos, which is from the 4th or 5th century AD. So it's a good century or more before that. We don't have the complete Forest of Laughter, Xiaolin book anymore, but there are excerpts which have been collected in later works. So we've got a good idea about the kind of humor that was included in that. And it's mostly iconoclastic, destructive. It highlights the foils and the follies and the foibles of society, and it mocks those people who are privileged or powerful, as well as those who are marginalized or powerless. So let me just give you one example of a joke from the oldest joke book in the world. This story concerns a man from North China, from the state of Han, who went to visit southern Chinese state of Wu. And it was there that for the first time in his life, he got to eat bamboo shoots, because bamboo doesn't grow in the north. Although many households do have things that are made of bamboo, like chopsticks or this picture of cool bed mats that keep you cool in the hot summer nights. Anyway, the man from Han obviously enjoyed his bamboo very much. So when he got home, he took out his bamboo bed mat and boiled it. And then he found he couldn't eat it. So what did he do? He went and complained to his wife that the people of Wu had cheated him. So that's just a joke about people from a distant place who are stupid, and you can make jokes about them because they're not going to get back at you. They are less powerful. They're not going to be a threat to you either physically or economically or politically. Every country in the world has got that kind of joke. We make jokes, for instance, about Kiwis in New Zealand. We make jokes about the Tasmanians. Other people in other parts of the world also make jokes about their stupid, dirty, annoying neighbours. Now, these kind of popular jokes were, of course, handed down in oral traditions. When printed books became popular in China, that is after the Ming Dynasty, scholars collected the jokes in printed volumes that sold like hotcakes. And the topics reflect common people's concerns, and they help to relieve people's frustrations with injustice and inequality. So you find jokes about corrupt officials, judges, Buddhist monks who are not very don't behave the way they should, about henpecked husbands and domineering mothers-in-law. Country bumpkins, people from other cities, people who speak with funny accents, people who are lazy, stupid, dirty. A lot of these are jokes you find in other cultures too. They're not exclusively Chinese. But this represents a kind of what I'm calling anti-authoritarian or iconoclastic, sarcastic kind of humor. It's not the Confucian humor. This is the other strain. Let's go back for a minute to the Confucian type humor and bring things up to date. The Chinese Communist Party has long made use of what I'm calling Confucian type humor for political purposes. And I'll just give you one example which comes from the 1930s, at the time Japanese invasion of China began. And it's a popular cartoon series called Sanmao, which means 3 hairs. It's about a little orphan boy. You can see he's always drawn with 3 hairs sticking out from under his cap. And the author, the cartoonist, is a man called Zhang Leping. So it describes the hard life under Japanese occupation, and it was used to mobilize anti-Japanese sentiment by stirring up people's sympathy for workers and the orphans. It became, in fact, a tool of government. And it fitted in with what Mao said about literature and arts, which was that they should serve government policies. So at that time, of course, censorship was already imposed by the nationalist government. Later on, this kind of censorship was continued by the communist government. So the alternative, not the propaganda type humor, but the anti-authoritarian humor, often went underground, but it was never totally suppressed. Totalitarianism can be maintained by force, but jokes are the weapons of the powerless. Humor will not overturn a regime, but the collection and the analysis of underground humor can be a good measure of how popular a government is and how likely it is to be long-lasting. So you can find this kind of relationship not only in China, but, for instance, in Stalinist Russia or in the Nazi concentration camps for Jewish people. You'll find both places there was an explosion of this kind of anti-authoritarian humor. Now let me just digress a bit from talking about China specifically, and explain, as Professor Han has mentioned, that in the last decade or so, I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about Chinese humor, whether it was uniquely Chinese, whether it really had distinct Chinese characteristics, and what was happening to it today. And in this, I worked closely with a renowned humor scholar, Jessica Davis, who happens to be my sister. So it was a very fruitful relationship and resulted in these two books that have been mentioned to you. I recommend them to you. At least the second one is available as a soft copy and can be downloaded and read on your computer or reading device. The first question that we had to deal with was how we defined humor, which is a problem that has engrossed scholars for the last century or more. It was investigated by European scholars such as Henri Bergson and Sigmund Freud. And I don't want to spend too much time on this. I just want to let you know that it is now a recognized field of academic work. And there are three main theories, which you can read more about if you're interested. One is called relief theory. That is that humor serves to reduce tension. The second theory is called superiority theory, that people like to laugh at others in order to assert their superiority. And the third one is called incongruity theory. That is that laughter derives from a realization of a basic incongruity between concepts and objects. I'd like to refer you in particular to a sociologist, Christy Davies, who proposed that humor is a form of play. There are countries and cultures with rules and conventions concerning political correctness, and Davies argues that in a totalitarian society, you find more political jokes, and you find fewer in a free society because there's not the same need for them due to the easy availability of jokes, for instance, in cartoons, television commentary, and so on. And he also defined topics that either feature or are conspicuously absent in different cultures, as set out in a brilliant essay which is called "The Dog That Did Not Bark in the Night." So if you find a culture where, for instance, there are no jokes about mothers-in-law, that will tell you something very interesting about the social position of mothers-in-law. And I'll also refer you to Rod Martin, who developed something called the Humour Styles questionnaire about 20 years ago, and that's been translated into many different languages and can be used to identify individual and cultural differences in humour styles. For instance, humour that serves to bind people together, humour that serves to, in that superiority theory, and humour that is self-defeating. So humour often about yourself, just to show other people that you recognize that you are, stupid and so on and so forth. So laughing at yourself. And he's found some very interesting differences through this questionnaire between people in different cultures. For instance, one study, not by him, but by another scholar, comparing humour in Taiwan and in Switzerland, found that Taiwanese were much more afraid of people laughing at them than the Swiss. So there are interesting cultural differences that can be identified that way. However you compare humour between different cultures, however, I go back to this sort of incongruity theory, because a typical joke will get you thinking along one line, and then the punchline will surprise you and show you that you've been going down the wrong garden path, and the real way of understanding is something different. Here's an example of that kind of joke, a typical construct. So see where it leads you, and then there's the punchline that will get you somewhere else. And this joke is in this form of question and answer. So the question is, Madonna doesn't have it. The Pope doesn't need it. Putin has a short one, and Albanese has a long one. Do you get it? What's the answer? In case you didn't get it, the answer is a surname. Now, what I want to lead on from that is to make the point that if you get the joke, you will not get the joke unless you understand who all these people are that I've mentioned. So in all humour, one of the basic facts is that you've got to have a common basis of shared knowledge. Otherwise, the speaker and the hearer will not be able to share the joke. So let me give you just one more example, because I think this is a very important point. Humour depends on having shared cultural knowledge. So here's a visual joke. There are no words that go with it. But anybody who doesn't know about recent Australian politics would never understand, would not see anything funny in this joke. You have to know the background about former Prime Minister Scott Morrison's decision during the COVID epidemic to assume various ministries without telling even his cabinet colleagues. So here he is in two of his alternative ministerial roles. But if you have to spend too much time explaining it to you, if you were from a country another country and didn't know anything about Australian politics, and I explained it to you, the more explanation I had to do, the less funny the joke would be. And that reminds me of a famous writer called E.B. White, who wrote in the New Yorker and other American magazines, and who wrote quite a long time ago. He said, "Humour can be dissected as a frog can, but the thing dies in the process." So in this talk, I hope I'm not dissecting Chinese humour, but I do want to talk about some of the particular things about Chinese humour that I think are unique or highly characteristic of Chinese culture. So let's move on to the second part of my talk. Is there anything unique about Chinese humor? And the answer to that is yes, particularly a linguistic kind of humor that's only possible because of the unique kind of Chinese writing script. And here's an example. It's a painting by an emperor, the Xuanzong Emperor of Ming Dynasty in the 14th century. And as you can see, it's a picture of a dog sitting in a grove of bamboos. So this is actually a kind of visual joke because it's based on taking the character for laugh and dividing it into two parts. The top part is bamboo, if it's written separately, and the bottom part, if it was written separately, is the character for dog. And therefore, you've got a picture of a dog under the bamboo. So if you understood Chinese writing, you would perhaps get this visual joke. Let me give you another example. This, I remember my Chinese language teacher told me ages ago. I just managed to retrieve it from the bottom of my half a century of learning. The story is that a school teacher was reviewing the work by his primary school students, and he read out the name of one of these students when he was handing back the work. He read Lin Dan Da. Those are the characters on the left-hand side. And no student called Lin Dan Da was in the class. So nobody came up to get the marked homework. And at the end of what he handed out all the others, there was one student left over who came up and said, "Oh," the teacher said, "are you Lin Dan Da?" And he said, "No, I am Zhu Zhongqian." Because his poor handwriting, you can, if you look at these characters, you can see the first one on the left appears the top part of the fourth character, and the top part of the second character appears as the bottom part of that fourth character, and so on. So it's all been broken up and reassembled, and that's only possible to make that kind of joke because you've got that kind of writing. And that is certainly something that's unique to China. And here's another one which I'm a little bit fearful about because I don't know whether the university will really allow me to use bad language in a lecture, but this is an example of a swear word. And it also combines, it's a character that's made up of three parts. And the top part is the character for grass, pronounced Cao, and the bottom left-hand side is the character for horse, pronounced Ma, and the bottom right-hand side is the character Ni, which means actually a Buddhist nun. And if you were to divide this character up and say the three parts all together, it would be the equivalent of in English saying fuck. So again, you could not have this kind of joke in any other language with any other kind of writing system except Chinese characters. Another particular characteristic of Chinese language is that it is exceptionally easy to make puns in Chinese language, because there are so many characters and words that sound the same as we have a lot in English, like here and dear and so on, but far more in Chinese than there are in English. And I'll just give you one example of this, which is, again, is kind of a visual pun. It is a pun for the word Google, which is pronounced in Chinese gu ge, and gu means valley, and ge means dove. So valley in the Californian sense, of Silicon Valley, so it's a valley dove. Therefore, it's a pun for Google. Here's another example of a pun that I learned from the daughter of a friend. It's based on the Chinese word for the deer, a male deer or stag, gonglu, which sounds the same as gonglu, which means a highway. So the joke is the stag ran faster and faster until he turned into an express highway. 一个公路越跑越快，最后它变成了高速公路。Very simple little pun. But this is possible because of the punability of Chinese language. Let's go on to another kind of unique, almost unique, not quite unique, form of humor in Chinese language, which is called a xiehoyu, which means a proverb where only the first part is stated and the second part has to be added by the listener, who has heard it before and therefore knows what it's referring to. You might, for instance, advise somebody that, you're talking about a powerful person. It's no good trying to flatter him or no good trying to flatter him by saying, oh, the bean curd has fallen into the powdered lime. 豆腐饺子吃会里. Or maybe you don't get it, but it is a proverb, and the person, if they have heard this proverb before, know that the part that's missing is really goes like this. The bean curd has fallen into the powdered lime, and blowing it is no use, and patting it is no use. You can't, it's damaged. 豆腐掉在石灰里，吹不行，拍也不行. A further complication of that is that the word 吹, blowing, is short for 吹牛, which means boasting, and the word 拍 is short for 拍马, which means flattery. So the full meaning, therefore, is boasting or flattery are not going to help you. This kind of humor, where you've got only, say, part of it, has been compared, for instance, to Cockney rhyming slang, where you might call your friend your old china plate, because the person knows that plate rhymes with mate, so you, instead of saying my mate, you say my china plate. Whether it's in Chinese or in English, you can see the common thing behind this kind of humor is that you've got to know the proverb. You have to have heard it before. It's an example of a kind of humor that's used to reinforce the bonds, the common understanding between groups, So people say, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, know what I mean? That kind of humor. Finally, in my last section, I would like to talk about, I gave you the punchline. Oh, well, I've already told you that. I'd like to talk about the development of humor in China in recent years. And this talk, of course, has to come to an end fairly soon, so I'm not going to go into details about this. I'll just give you one example of how humor is always evolving by referring to how a traditional form of humor, which is called xiangsheng, or a comic dialogue, stage dialogue, evolves into a new form, which is called stand-up, or Dang in the mainland, it's called Dankou Xiangsheng. Interestingly, in Hong Kong, they use Cantonese word stand up, dong dong, and xiu, which means laughter. So Xiangsheng, the traditional form of comic dialogue, was a very popular in the 19th century and the Republican period. And there are famous Xiangsheng scripts from that time. Very often they were used to mock the nouveau riche or the colonial society. After 1949, Xiangsheng was also conscripted by the Communist Party as a kind of moral improvement, Confucian-type humor, and used to contribute to various political campaigns. And the actors or the writers had to walk a very fine line between satiric, sarcastic comment and the risk of censorship. When Xiangsheng is performed by one person, it's called a one-person Xiangsheng, Dankou Xiangsheng. So I'd just like to give you an example of a one-person Xiangsheng, which I have translated for your benefit into English. In this case, it's the performer has a stage name. He calls himself Little Shenyang, Shenyang being a city in northeast China, Xiao Shenyang. And here's my translation of part of one of his xiangsheng. Well, sometimes I've been lucky in love. And the other day, with my little bag, dear friends, you know I come from northeast China, somewhere near Shenyang. So I was with my little bag and I was walking on the street, and while I was walking, a girl came up to me and she looked quite outstanding and pretty. She was about 17 or 18, and she excitedly asked me, she said, "Bro, are you the guy who performs xiangsheng, the guy called Xiao Shenyang?" And I replied, "Yeah, so?" "Bro, every time I look at you, I think of the sea." How sweet she was, dear friends. That was the first time anybody praised me as the sea. I was so happy. I asked, "Do you like me? Are you falling in love with me?" But her answer was so irritating. "Bro, please don't misunderstand me," she said. "I get seasick. When I see the sea, I just throw up." I've lost that one. Yeah. So the history of xiangsheng and stand-up show that how Chinese humor is continually evolving and responding to local and international trends. Over the last 150 years, of course, stand-up came in mainly from America, and there have been a lot more international connections between China and the West, and that has had an effect, particularly on the modernization of humor. So you have all kinds of new forms developing, such as cartoons, which developed after China introduced the newspapers that were already current in Japan, Western-style movies, pop songs, advertising, internet jokes, all of them. You can find examples of how humor forms are developing and modernizing. I've just given you an example of one cartoon there on the right, which you can see could be taken as a comment about either about somebody being indecisive, or maybe it's a comment about how governments decide to do things and then change their mind and do something else instead. Anyway, it's left to the reader, because there's no text that goes with it, to decide what it applies to exactly. Finally, I'd like to say something about persecution or censorship. As I've said, humour flourishes under persecution. In former times, jokes could be written written down on scraps of paper and passed from hand to hand. In this age, of course, the internet facilitates the transmission swiftly and relatively anonymously. And China has the largest internet community, online community in the world. So as you can imagine, there's been an explosion of internet humor. And here's just one example from the year 2008, which was the year of the rabbit. And it was sparked by a scandal about contaminated baby formula milk produced by the Sanlu Dairy Company. So there was an online video New Year greeting card that told the story about a community of rabbits whose babies had been poisoned and how they rose up against their overlords, who were the tigers. And this video really was a bit too close to the bone for the government authorities, and it was banned. That's why this particular slide is not very good quality, because it's come from a reproduction rather than from the original video. But even though it was banned, it did have an effect, and the Sanlu company was closed down because of this tragic circumstance. So I've used this particular picture because it shows the kind of cat and mouse game that's played between the netizens and the censors. Humour, of course, is the sharpest, and humorists around the world relish the challenge most when they're working on the boundary of what's permitted and what is not. And in these days of political correctness in Australia or of state regulation in China, there is always a very fine line, and humorists are treading that line very carefully, hoping that they can get away with things. And as I'd like to conclude by telling you about how one humorist in China tried to get around censorship that applies to so many different things with the following joke, which was posted briefly anyway online. And it goes like this. While I was out and about on my holiday, I stubbed my toe on something, and on closer inspection, I saw it was a bronze lamp. And it was a bit smudgy and dirty, so I picked it up and gave it a good wipe. And out popped a genie. And the genie said he could grant me any wish. Is that really so? I said. If it is, do you think you could make you know who do you know what? But no sooner had the words escaped my mouth than the genie rushed over and clamped my mouth shut and said, "I'm not sure we're even allowed to say that." So all I can say is, long live Chinese humor.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. Oh, what a delightful talk. Just so funny. So much actually packed in your talk, and so many aspects. So audience, if you have questions, you can post in the Q&A. while I'm asking a few questions, Jocelyn. So many questions, so I actually don't know where to start, because all the examples that you use, actually, you yourself have lived lots of jokes, lived experiences of jokes while you were in China. So I'm thinking, the other way around, you mentioned that the joke, humor. Oh yeah, to start with, the one thing first, and it's really interesting to hear that humor is actually from English, and it does make me think. And what's the word for Chinese then? What before humor? What now? It's like an ingredient in Chinese culture and the mind, so you can't really think of another word. I mean, we do say 笑话, joke, but 笑话 can also be very sarcastically like ridiculous, some 笑话, so don't be ridiculous. So it's not exactly. What would be the word for Chinese?
Well, there were several words, but the one which I mentioned in my talk is kwaji.
Oh, that's
kwaji,
right.
kwaji, the jokes, the jesters. But kwaji, I think some people would say it's more like wit. It's clever talking. Yeah. And then you have to distinguish between what's wit and what's humor.
That's right.
It's a whole other subject.
Yes, like you mentioned, Lin Yutang says humor is the highest level of intelligence because it does require intelligence. Can you give us an example about the English humor that are characteristic English humor that can't be, for example, get over to Chinese?
Well, I think it's often very, if you don't share the cultural background, you will not understand the joke. I do have an example, and this is from my very first visit to China. I went with a university delegation, it's University of Sydney, and the professor who was leading the delegation at our farewell dinner in Beijing, he told me beforehand that he was going to make a speech, and he said, I think I should introduce a good Australian joke. And I said to him, Professor, I don't think this is a very good idea because jokes can be very difficult to translate. And he said, no, it's all right. I've talked to the interpreter, and the interpreter says he understands it, and he can translate it, and it will go down fine. So the joke was like this. It's actually comes from a classic collection of humorous writing about two characters called Dad and Dave. And Dad and Dave are sort of country people, not sophisticated. They live a very quiet rural life, and most of the stories about their life in the country. And this particular story is about how they've just had a telephone installed on their farm, but they haven't yet used it. So after a day's hard work on the farm, they're sitting down on the outside in a comfortable chair, having a beer and relaxing, and the phone rings. Oh, what's that, Dave? Says Dad. Oh, that'll be the phone, Dad. Oh, can you go and see what's going on, Dave? Right, Dad, I'll go. So Dave goes off, he comes back, he sits down, picks up his beer again, and Dad says, well? He said, I don't know, Dad. He said, well, some Sheila. She said, this is a long distance from Sydney. And I said, yes. I don't think even you have got it.
I got it. It gets a long distance call rather than
because
long
that's
distance.
the main part was just because it was like a shorthand term for this is a long distance call from Sydney, not just this place is a very long way away. Well, the interpreter didn't get it. And when he translated it, he got to that punchline and he said, this place is a very long way away from Sydney. And it's not funny, right? There is no humor in it if you don't understand that. So the poor interpreter then said to the assembled people, he said, the professor tells me this is a famous Australian joke, so would you please all laugh? And everybody laughed.
I know when translation is involved, it gets even harder.
Yeah.
But that joke is actually interesting because the long distance, I mean, physically it is a long distance because otherwise the joke would be lost. And also long distance call needs to be on people's mind. Yeah. But also I'm wondering whether this joke will be understood by Australian young people.
Oh, yeah.
No idea of a long distance call. What is a long distance call?
Yeah, I mean, these days, everybody has their mobile.
Yes, that's right. So they may actually truly say, oh, okay, so what's so funny? It's so far away from Sydney. Yes. So, yeah, it's interesting that I think it goes back to your saying shared knowledge has to be shared. Yeah, when that shared base is not there, and then the joke can be lost. Yeah, but the characteristics that you mentioned goes a lot with the languages itself. The Chinese ones has a lot to do with Chinese characters, the Chinese pronunciation. Yeah, so are there any humor that just, it's not language, it's just people, two different nations just don't share that humor. One side doesn't see it's humor, the other.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of taboo subjects. And the taboos may be different in different cultures. It's not acceptable in Australia, for instance, to make jokes about handicapped people. And these days we also shouldn't be making jokes about ethnic minorities and so on. But these taboos don't necessarily exist in other cultures. So you can have a joke which we would regard as offensive. These are the rules. I sometimes say, if you had a ruler and you had a culture where you could make a joke about anything, anyone, at any time, in any circumstances, and you had another culture in which you're not allowed to make jokes about anything at all, Australia would be at one end and China would be down towards the other end.
That's actually so true. Yeah, so true. It just reminds me of an actual example that one of the students gave to me, because he gave an example that the Simpsons being dubbed into Arabic. And Arabic as a language, especially formal language, is very clean and neat, no swear words, no, taboo things. And then lots of things regarded as taboo. So Homer was not allowed to drink beer. So whenever he drinks beer, it's changed to soda. And he's not allowed to eat bacon. So the bacon became anonymous sausages. And then whenever he says F, it becomes hello. So, and then at the end of the episode, Homer is not funny anymore. So it's quite interesting that, all the taboo bits make Homer as a Homer.
Yes.
Yeah, and when those bits are taken off and he become like no character. So yeah, it's fascinating. We have a question from Chris Chen. Jocelyn, what an interesting overview. What is the most challenging issue faced when studying Chinese humor in particular? That's one question.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's this shared cultural knowledge, isn't it? And particularly, you know, I've looked at some of these classic joke books, and to me, I don't find the jokes particularly funny. A joke about a Buddhist monk, for instance, or something, because I mean, we live in a society where Buddhist monks don't have the social status that they used to have, so 300 years ago. So, so you've really got to. I think as you said yourself in the introduction, Jing, that you know, if you get the humor, that shows that you've got a deep cultural understanding. Yeah. So you can't put the humor first. You've got to have the cultural understanding first.
That's true. That is true, because even when I got a studying PhD in Sydney first year, I didn't get the jokes. It's so frustrating watch a sitcom because it's a studio, so they have studio audience laugh. Whenever they laugh, I got nervous because I don't get the joke. Why are they laughing? So what's so funny? And it's not about the language. It's really understanding the culture. Chris has a second part of question. Any insight on how humor, particularly from historical periods, when it was often transmitted orally, can be recovered in the absence of recordings? Yeah, being a historian, Chris, yeah.
Well, yes, I think if we talk about the history of humor in China, we must first of all recognize that we only have the written records. There must have been lots of jokes and funny stories that have just disappeared, and also not just because they weren't written down, but particularly because they were written down by men. You know, I mean, these days, women have a much higher social status than they used to have. So women's language and women's humor was not recorded. And also, they were written by Han people, so they didn't collect the jokes that were circulating amongst people from various dialect regions, and that's important now. I think people should pay more attention to collecting and recording all of these sorts of examples of humor before they're lost. Just like people go around and collect folk songs and record them before they're lost. So we should be collecting the jokes before they're lost too. That's an important historical task.
That's so true. Yes, Chris, that's your next project. Yes, indeed. Right. And a very interesting one. So I'm here to collect the jokes. So tell me your jokes.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting. And also very insightful. You saying that women, like the female jokes were not collected, obviously not recorded, not even saved anywhere, so because of the social status. So that's really, really interesting. That's from a historical point of view, and then that shows a lot of history. We have last question allowed. So Emeritus Professor Michael Atherton, thank you for a fascinating talk. Humor in traditional folk songs is likely universal and is often used to satirize male-female courtship rituals. Yeah. Are you familiar with examples of the same in Chinese cultures? That's a very good question.
I can't sing you any. Just now when you were talking about women, a good old joke came to me about a group of men who were drinking tea perhaps or beer. I don't know. They were having a social gathering, and they got round to talking about which of them had the most bossy wife or mother-in-law at home. And they couldn't agree on whose family situation was the most difficult. So in the end, they drew a line on the ground, and they said, those men who were afraid of their wives could stand on this side of the line, and those men who are not afraid of their wives can stand on that side of the line. So the whole group separated except for one, and he just stayed sitting where he was. And they said, come on, you can't, you know, you can't be neither one or the other. And he said, oh, well, I don't know which side of the line I should go on because my wife isn't here to tell me.
That's a very good one, and also a very universal one, because so
it is actually a Chinese story.
yeah, oh, I see, because obviously afraid of your wife, it's a virtue in many ways, in Chinese culture, or at least that's how people compare, your husband is good or bad. That just also reminds me, as a last joke to share about the culture, because it has culture value into it. And you mentioned the mother-in-law jokes are everywhere in Australian culture and English culture, and I've heard so many. But the mother-in-law in Chinese, I mean, all the elders are quite highly respected. You don't often joke about your parents or grandparents, including mother-in-law, although these days it's sort of a
Well, you would only joke in private.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
That's an important part of the rules about humor, as where and to whom you can make a joke.
That's so true. That's so true. And then this joke about the mother-in-law, and I was wondering whether this can be actually played, appreciated, or at least public in China. It says, mother-in-law died and on the Holy Land. So they told the man, the son-in-law said, if we bury your mother-in-law on the Holy Land, it costs you $500, but we transport it back to your home and bury, that would cost $5,000. And he thought about it and he said, yes, I take $5,000. And then he said, why you take an expensive one, and then buried in Holy Land? And he said, a man was once buried on Holy Land, and a week later, he came back live again. And so he said, I can't take the chance.
Not very nice joke about mothers-in-law, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's quite harsh on mother-in-law. And I feel the sting. I said, oh, okay. So that's really interesting. Humor is such an interesting topic. And Jocelyn, it's not surprising, actually, Jocelyn got this topic for her research, because if you know Jocelyn well, and you always laugh, and she has a great sense of humor and has lots of jokes, too many to share today. So thank you all for attending this talk. We will send the video to everyone shortly after tomorrow. And then the next Culture Talk comes up, we'll send advertising to everyone. Thank you again. Thank you, Jocelyn. Such a delightful evening. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good evening. Bye.